Well, hey y'all, and welcome to the Hillbilly Chicken Ranch. I'm Susan, your hostess. We're going to be shelling peas today while I talk about my memories of my mom, my grandma, and my aunts. And we have purple hull peas here, y'all. Look at this. Last night we had squash, we had green beans that were all fresh, and they were delicious, by the way, with some hamburger patties. All I did was cook up some hamburger patties with a little seasoning on it, add a little bit of ketchup towards the end of it, and I've got my big pan because we always used a wash pan to do our peas in. Now they would fill their bowl up with all their peas. They would push the shells to one side, the peas to the front. But I've got a little trash can sitting beside me, so the shells are going to actually go into a bag in the trash can. You can make purple hull jelly from these hulls. Matter of fact, you can make different flavored jellies from different types of peas, the pea shells. These will taste like grape, so it would make a mock grape flavor. And so basically all I'm doing is I'm pulling the shell off. I've allowed these to dry for a couple of days because they were very, very wet. Some of them may not be dry enough yet to really pull them apart like this, but it was very easy to shell peas back in the day. And these are purple hull peas. They kind of look like a black-eyed pea. They have a little bit of a different flavor. They are delicious, and we love them. So I've got some of them canned on my shelf. I've actually got a lot of them in the freezer still from last year. These will be going into the freezer as well, and when I get low, I'll just pull them out of the freezer and get them on my canning shelf and have them ready to go to eat. So that is one of the shells. When I was a little girl, I would go to one of my grandparents' house, the one that lived down in Mississippi in a log cabin. And now they had a pull string light in the middle of the ceiling. They had a pot-bellied stove in the middle of each room. My grandmother still cooked on a wood-burning stove. They drew water from a well. We had to walk a bit to get to the outhouse, and they would put slop buckets under the beds at night in case you had to get up to go to the bathroom. Quite a different lifestyle than we have today. Today we have the modern conveniences of electricity, indoor plumbing. We have bathrooms inside the house and not outside the house. We have fresh water from our well that is brought up electrically. So we have a well pump that draws the water up with an electrical current that raises it to the surface. So we have all the modern conveniences that they didn't have. We even have air conditioning and heat inside. Although we thought about putting in a wood-burning stove at one time inside our home. We may still do that in the future, I don't know, but right now we're comfortable where we're at. So in my grandmother's home, they had a big long kitchen. The kitchen was a pretty good size, and they had a table over in one corner, and then along the same wall she had her wood-burning stove, but it was further down, closer to the back door. The back door was always open with a screen on it unless it was wintertime. Then they would close the wood door. It had no steps out that back door. She would actually open it up and just throw the table scraps out to the dogs. They didn't buy dog food like we do today. They always had ample scraps left over to feed the animals, and they were well fed. But she would throw out all the table scraps. And she always had a bowl in her kitchen covered with a towel on her dough board, and that was where she made her homemade biscuits. And there was always biscuits sitting on top of that wood-burning stove being kept warm. There was always a table full of goodies that she had made. Usually breakfast was left over, whatever was left over from breakfast became lunch, and then she would cook supper on her stove. So she only heated up the house twice, and she'd always have every kind of meat you can imagine on the table for breakfast. It was just amazing. They had, their bed was in a long living room. They had a couch on one wall over here, pot-bellied stove in the middle. They had a little TV, little bitty TV set, 2 rocking chairs in there that they sat in, and their bed was in the corner by the front door, or the side door. It was actually the door we came in, so I would consider it the front door. And the steps on that was quite steep, so they had to go up and down those steps. I loved that old house. I have a full memory of that house. I spent a lot of time in there with cousins and aunts and uncles and family, and just absolutely loved going there. My grandmother would get in her rocking chair with her big dish pan full of peas or whatever she was working on that day, and she would sit there and she would rock, and she would do this, and I don't know how she could rock and hold a bowl like this, but she managed. And she would always give me a bowl, and we would talk about life. It was such a fun time because it was one of the few times I remember really getting to know my grandmother, was when we would be talking while we were shelling peas or whatever vegetable we were working on that day. So it was always a pleasure for me to help her. I remember her being out in her garden. She had already lost her eyesight, but she would go out into her garden, and she would work her garden even though she was blind. She was legally blind. She had a macular degeneration disease in her eyes. She was also up in years. She was pretty close to 90, if not 90 already, out in her garden. She had a larder, or pantry outside. I can't remember what it was called, but it was underground. It was actually under the house. They had dug out an area underneath the house, and that's where she kept her canned goods that she had canned. And not only did the canned goods stay in there, but the chickens roasted in there at night. So everything had to be washed thoroughly before we could even open a jar of all the good stuff that she had preserved. It was always a joy to go there. And like I said, childhood memories just comes flooding back every time I shell peas. Now, my aunts, the one aunt that I would go to and stay, she had a big long table in her kitchen, and she had a big front porch. And so it just depended on if it was raining or not, where we would shell peas at. Normally, we would shell peas out on the front porch, and she had these straight back chairs with the cane bottoms, you know, you sit straight up, and we would just sit out there and just talk and laugh and giggle and just have a great time sharing with one another. These women are long gone, and I miss them terribly, but I cannot thank them enough for the memories that they gave me, the life lessons that they gave me, especially when it comes to canning and preserving food. My grandmother raised 8 children in a log cabin. She had 2 sons, one of them being my dad. My dad was the second oldest, and then she had a set of triplets, and then she had the rest of the kids. My dad's memory of her having babies was his grandmother lived with them, and every time my grandmother would have a baby, the older kids would be taken into the kitchen and they would make donuts and coffee for all the visiting relatives that would come to visit the new babies. And so my dad just assumed that coffee and donuts went with babies. And I got the biggest kick out of it when I had my first daughter, because he came to the hospital with a bag of donuts and a cup of coffee. And I asked him what the donuts and coffee was for, and he says, well, you just had a baby, and that's just the way we always celebrated the babies. So I just thought that was the sweetest story in the world. But my grandmother, he was telling me stories about her, would be in the field working. They had about 300 and something acres of land. She would be in the field working alongside her husband and family, and she would go into labor, come into the house, have the baby or babies, strap them onto her back, and return to the field. There was no rest time for her. She had a family to provide for, and she worked as hard, if not harder, than her husband did, because she was out there with him, and they did everything together. Family time was always wonderful because the memories are around the kitchen table. I think we have lost a lot of that in this generation that's coming up, because they don't eat at the dinner table like we did in our day. And Sunday dinners, we missed out on the Sunday dinners. My aunt, I had 2 aunts and an uncle that were triplets. The other aunt I went to stay with one year for the summer, and they had a big, long, humongous table that he had built in a huge kitchen, and it was a kitchen / family room. And he had done all the work on that, and it was just beautiful. And she would be in there cooking or whatever, and she would bring in her peas, and we would sit at that long table, and we would shell peas and talk and laugh and giggle and tell stories. And I learned so much from these women. I really enjoyed my time with them. One of the things that they taught me, along with my parents, was to work hard and to try not to complain about the work that we had to do. Now, I'm a complainer. I'm not going to lie. I do complain. But I don't mean anything when I complain. I want to provide a good, firm foundation of food for my family. I want them to have healthy foods that are good for them to have. Now, these peas were grown by the Amish, and it's organically grown, which means occasionally I'm going to find some bad beans in there. That's okay. I can live with that. After all, we had the same thing when I was growing up. It was organically grown. It wasn't until the grocery stores really took over the family gardens. They stopped gardening because they found it just easier to go to the store and pick up a can of peas instead of preserving the food and putting it back. My mom and dad lived in the city. They lived in Memphis, Tennessee. And so when I was younger, they would go down to the farm market down there, and you could buy a bushel of whatever vegetable that you wanted to put up that week. And so I remember many times shelling peas with my mom and visiting relatives that might have been visiting at the time, and we would sit around between the living room and dining room. We had a humongous living room, dining room combination in the house that I grew up in kitchen chairs, you know, those old metal kitchen chairs with the vinyl, you know, the bright colored vinyl seats on them. And then that was actually our dining room set, was just a kitchen set. And then in our kitchen was just a homemade table with a couple of older chairs that they would eat breakfast in there. And then family dinners were every Sunday, and we would all gather around the table and have fried chicken or pot roast or something good that my mother had made, with a table full of fresh vegetables that she had prepared. But I learned a lot about family just by listening to the older women talking amongst themselves. And I was just a child, so, you know, I didn't understand a lot of the stuff that they were talking about. But it was always a joy just to sit there with them and talk. Now, I don't remember neighbors really coming to visit very much. It was always family that came to visit. We didn't have so-called friends pop in and things like that. My mother was very, very private when it came to raising her family. We were allowed to have friends outside the family and go on sleepovers and things like that. But I had a very strict schedule. Growing up, I could only go to a friend's house for 1 hour, and I had to be home within that hour. So I really didn't have a full hour to play. And I could have a friend come and spend the night with me occasionally. It wasn't very often, but occasionally she would allow me to have a friend over to spend the night. When I was a child, I've shared this before, I came home, I don't know if it was school or Sunday school or what, but we had grown we had planted peas, and we put them in a little Dixie cup, and when they started sprouting, we brought them home. Well, I brought mine home, and Mother said, "Oh, that's so sweet," and she didn't think anything about it. Well, I took it out in the backyard, and I planted it. Then I went back in the house, and I was looking for whatever I could plant. And so I found some popcorn, and I took the popcorn out there, and I planted it along one side of the fence. I don't think I planted that many, maybe four kernels or something like that. And then I found some old potatoes that had started to sprout, and I took them outside, and I dug a hole, and I planted those. And I didn't think anything about it, didn't water them or anything, and they all grew. And my mother came out one day, and she says, "I recognize that plant. Did you plant this?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am, I planted that." And so we got out there with a shovel, and we dug up the potatoes. So we had a good crop of potatoes off that. And we had plenty of popcorn off the ears of corn, because we allowed it to go to seed or to dry out naturally. And my little pea plant put out some peas. And then I was looking around the yard one day, and I came across some wild asparagus. And I brought it in to my mother. I said, "Is this edible?" And she says, "That's asparagus. Where'd you find that?" And so I showed her the little patch of asparagus that was in the yard. We had a wild grapevine back there. We had blackberries. We had an apple tree, a sour apple tree. And we had figs. So my mother would do a lot of preserves and stuff like that, so that we'd have all that on our pantry shelves. When Mother found out that the backyard was so fertile, the next year we were out there with she was out there with a shovel, and I was out there with a hoe and a rake, and I was picking up the plugs of grass and shaking them out and getting as much dirt off of them as I could, and tossing them to the side while she was digging up our garden plot. Mother hand dug a garden plot with nothing more than a shovel. And it was a good sized garden. Our backyards down there, the houses were on 1/3 of an acre in the neighborhood that we lived in. So the majority of the property was the backyard. And so we had a really nice sized garden back there. And then our neighbors started putting in a garden because they saw Mother putting in a garden. And then the neighbor on the other side started gardening as well. So I started a trend as a young child, just gardening. Wasn't that fun? I'm not getting very far on these peas, but I'm getting close to 20 minutes on my video. So I'm going to cut this short. I'm just going to show you what I've got done so far. I'm going to be sitting here for a while. I've got a lot of peas to do. But during this conversation, I've done all of those. Isn't that great? So when you're out there in your garden, ladies or men, grab your family and get them involved. Get the kids involved, shelling and preparing the food for storage. Teach those life lessons to them at a young age so that they will have that when they are old, like me. And it will be a blessing to them because we know how the economy is going. We know how the prices in the stores are going. So don't be afraid to dig up a plot and plant something. If you live in an apartment, plant some herbs in a pot and put them in a windowsill. Well, y'all, I thank you for coming along with me today. I hope that you will be fully blessed. I'm going to be working on these peas until they're done, and then I'm going to be in my kitchen again tomorrow working on some stewed tomatoes. Be blessed, everybody.